Hi, how are you all today? Are you ready to look at Rubric 4 of Task 1? We're going to be talking about academic language and how to write about that in the planning commentary. Some of you may still be struggling with academic language, and if that's the case, you should go to the Demystifying Academic Language tape that I have on YouTube and take a look at it and review. So the first thing we're going to look at is just 4A. What you're going to do is that you're going to think about in your entire learning segment, what is the best activity that you did that involved language? And you're going to write about just one of those. So using the information that you know about your students' language assets and needs, identify one language function from the list below, essential for students to develop the, whatever your SSE is. Remember, that's the literacy strategy or those mathematic things. So all you have to do here is choose either the one of the functions that are listed there in 4A in your handbook, or come up with one with your own. Remember, it should be a verb, and it should be a brainy verb, a verb that shows that it's all about your thinking. So my language function is, that's all you have to write, one sentence for 4A. Writing more than that is very unnecessary, and so I just would not write more than one sentence. So you're going to write, my language function is, and that's it. That's all for 4A. 4B. Now here is where you identify that language task. So you're going to actually find from your learning segment one key learning task that provides the students with opportunities using that language function that you just identified in 4A. So if you said analyze was your, or analyzing was your language function, then you're going to now identify it. And now it's very important to pay attention to these verbs like identify. I'm not asking you to describe or anything, just identify. And you only identify one. Now, I will say that sometimes people start an activity and they continue that activity over a number of days. So, for example, if your students were, if you all were working on learning to write a paragraph, and on the first day, everyone wrote the topic sentence, and on the second day, everybody wrote the concluding sentence, then you know that's one activity that's taken over several days, but we're still looking at one learning task. So you're going to identify it, one, only one, and this task must clearly utilize that function that you just stated in 4A. You only really need to give the lesson day and the number. So you'll say something like this: a key learning task that provides students with opportunities to practice using the language function in ways that support the essential literacy strategy is on day 3. Students will be taking their important points from the 2 texts they analyzed and create a Venn diagram to compare and contrast the important points they pull from the task. Now, she's done this because compare and contrast is her language function that she identified in 4A. And so she wanted to make sure it was there. She's actually written more than she has to, but that's okay. And here's another example. The key learning task that provides students with the opportunity to practice using the language function, explain, is the piggy bank activity found in lesson 4. Now this is really well written because it says the key learning task is, it says it gives them opportunity to practice the language function, which is exactly from the prompt, opportunities to practice using the language function, and it tells what the activity is found in lesson 4. Perfect. Okay, So, additional language demands. So this is where it gets into your syntax or discourse. It says additional language demands given the language function and learning task identified above, which would be 4B. Describe the following associated language demands, written or oral, students need to understand and use vocabulary and or symbols, plus at least one of the following. Now, as you know, you get no extra points for identifying both syntax and discourse, and that actually can mess you up. So I always tell people, choose syntax or discourse. Choose syntax or discourse, not both. So the best way to approach this prompt is in 2 paragraphs. In your first paragraph, you're going to identify the discourse or syntax. You're going to actually say, my discourse, or the discourse in this lesson was when students blah, 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 and you'll describe the language activity. They might have been talking to one another or writing something or sharing or reading or presenting, but they were doing some kind of learning language task. So you're going to describe, now you're going to describe it after you've identified it, you're going to describe it in detail. Then describe how the function is used in the discourse and syntax. So it's important to identify the discourse, and you say, my discourse was, or my syntax was, because one of the things that the score is going to check is that they're going to see, does this person seem to know the difference between discourse and syntax? Then in your second paragraph, you're going to identify the vocabulary needed for the learning task. You're going to describe how it supports the function and describe how the vocabulary is used within the discourse and syntax. So you don't just write down every single vocabulary word used in the lesson. You identify the vocabulary that is necessary for them to complete this task. Complete the function. What kind of words do they need in order to compare and contrast or analyze? What are some words that they need in their discourse, in their syntax? That's the kind of vocabulary. So it doesn't have to be a long list. It can be a very short list. You just need to address it. So here's an example. Let me get out of here so you can see it. The discourse that students need to complete the learning task is to respond to the set of text-dependent questions. So there you can clearly see the discourse that they need to, for the learning task is to respond to a set of text-dependent questions. Students will read a passage of text and then use the information in the text to respond to a set of questions. When responding to the questions, they will have to go back into the passage, find the answer, and then support their answer referring to evidence. And so she's described what they're going to do for the discourse. Now she comes down here in paragraph 2 and she talks about the vocabulary. The vocabulary that the students will need to complete the learning task includes refer, text evidence, explanation, explain. So she goes on and includes all of those. Now, we get to 4D. 4D, identify and describe the planned instructional supports during and or prior to. Okay, so during the learning task or prior to. So if you had done some things the day before or a couple of days before or during this learning segment, if you'd done some things to get students ready for this activity, then that's considered a support. It's instructional strategies you got them ready to, or support that you did to help them develop. So anything that you did in the lesson or before the lesson to help students understand, develop, and use the identified language demands, function, vocabulary or symbols, syntax or discourse. Now here's where all of the, really, all the points for prompt 4 come from. So I can't tell you enough how important this prompt is. So follow the suggestions here for the paragraphs. Paragraph 1, describe the supports for your function. How did you help students understand, develop, and use the function? This can include strategies before or during the key task, and you want to reference the lesson plan and instructional materials. So it's not enough to say that you did it. You need to be saying things like, as you can see in lesson 3, or on day 4 we, or if you look at my instructional materials you will see, and that's what they're talking about. Paragraph 2, describe the supports for your vocabulary. How did you help students understand, develop, and use the vocabulary? So this is where you want to show some good strategies for developing vocabulary. Marzano's got 6 steps that are really good that you should be familiar with. You can include, of course, strategies before, during the key task, and again, reference your instructional materials. And then I've put this here because it's important to now, when you're writing, to use some sentences that make it really easy and clear for the scorer to see and be able to find the evidence in order to support the function, right? In order to support the vocabulary, and it follows. In order to support the discourse. Don't worry about repeating yourself. It makes it easier to read. It makes it easier. So make sure you describe the supports for the syntax or discourse, not both. Even if you think you've got both, I don't care. You're only going to choose one. And then in paragraph 4, it's important to describe any supports that you used that were to help specific individuals or groups with a language need. Now, when you think about language needs, remember that language can be written or oral. So if you have students with speaking problems, writing problems, like if they have trouble reading, writing, speaking, listening. I know none of you have any students with problems with listening, right? Well, that's actually a language problem. And some listen, but they don't learn well that way. They're very, maybe have some auditory processing problem. That's language. Some can read and understand, but they can't express themselves. They either can't express themselves well orally, or they can't express themselves well in written form. So there's lots of things to consider. So when you're talking about their needs in this section, make sure you're focusing on language needs, okay? All right. And now let's take a look at what those supports, because this is where it's really confusing, and having this, I think, is helpful. It helps you remember the difference in the different kinds of supports. So general supports are supports that are available to all students almost all the time. And it's not been specifically designed for any particular language demand or task. These are things that are available in the room, like word walls, often anchor charts that are up all the time, glossaries, notes. These are always available. But sometimes good teachers will make things or find things that are specific to what they're working on. So if you have specifically designed or created or found a support for students to use to help them with function, for example, modeling how to use a Venn diagram would help students with function, and that would be considered a support. Having a special word bank developed just for this learning task would be a way to support the vocabulary. And then if you're having the students, for instance, write an essay, providing an outline is an example of giving a support for the discourse. So right now, the things that I'm providing for you all as you're writing your commentaries, those are supports. There are other examples like graphic organizers, sentence stems like the ones I've shown you, models, representations. Okay, so an individual, these are supports that have have been specifically designed or created for the purpose of supporting specific students or groups of students with anticipated difficulties. So, for example, having students pair it up, reader, non-reader, allowing voice to text, having students be able to use a keyboard rather than a pencil, having them be able to choose to do their work either oral or written. So these are some supports for individuals. So the difference between individual and target is that these target demands and this targets students. That's important to know the difference between target and an individual, because that's what's going to make the biggest difference with your score. So I want you to look. This person has used the outline that I gave. In order to support the function of this lesson, students will be using a graphic organizer, a Venn diagram, daily in order for them to understand how to compare and contrast two texts. And it goes on to explain about that. And then again, in order to support vocabulary, and look how, they've bolded those words, and it really stands out. It's really fantastic. Have two different sets of vocabulary in this learning segment, one for understanding keywords and one for understanding applying the language. So this is really good, very strong. In order to support the discourse, the students will be completing the Venn diagrams, which also supports the language function. I think that's a little weak. But then she goes on to explain what she's done. So it's actually very good. And when we look at how this works out with the rubric, so the information for level 1, so what a score is going to do is that they're going to make sure, first of all, that the language task that you describe is in line with the language function that you selected, and that the demands that you choose fit. And so again, it has to do with alignment. And that's going to be shown in 4A and 4B. And then if the supports that you suggest or describe are missing, which means if you didn't do 4D, or if you didn't understand what you were doing in 4D, or if they're not aligned with the demand, then that's also an automatic 1. Level 2, 3, 4, and 5. All of that information comes from, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get out of there, comes from 4A through D, but primarily it's going to come from 4D. Because look, supports, 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 supports. All of this is about your supports. So if you just describe one language demand, function, vocabulary, syntax, or discourse, if you just do one of those and describe supports that are fairly general, it's not going to get you but a 2. If you describe support for 2 of these demands, function and vocabulary, or say vocabulary and discourse, then that's going to be a 3. But if you have targeted support, so here's the difference between general, targeted. See those? So if you have targeted supports, like I showed you on that chart, for all of the demands, targeted supports for vocabulary, function, and discourse or syntax, and that's a 4. And if you get the 4 and you also write about what you plan to do to help students who struggle with language and the language task, that's going to be a 5. So in my mind, I think 5 would be a pretty easy thing to get on this. So that actually does end us for today. I want to encourage you to go ahead and write. Oh, my hair looks really funny. Sorry, you don't want to hear about my hair. What is this? What is this stuff here? What is this stuff? Okay, so I want to encourage you to go ahead and write prompt 4 while it's fresh on your mind and you have the information. If you're still struggling with academic language, go ahead and look at that video that's on YouTube, and I also have it on D2L for you to find it. Go ahead and look at that and review that. You might not need to listen to the whole thing, that's fine, but you do need to understand. As far as the academic language that's in your lesson plans, well, the scores are going to be looking at your lesson plans as a way to support the things that you're saying. So the learning task that you describe in this commentary does need to be one of your language activities that you describe in one of your lesson plans, but it doesn't have to be any more detailed than what we normally have you do. So no one actually scores your lesson plans. Your lesson plans are supporting documentation. They're evidence that backs up the stuff that you say in the commentary, okay? So don't be panicky about those. You can always go back and change your lesson plans, add to them, and all of that. So I will see you next time for prompt 5, and that'll be our last one for the planning commentary. Okay? Bye.